We returned to our crippled refuge, in higher spirits than I'd anticipated. Jurgen lugging a canister of fuel from the smallest of vehicles we'd found along with us. It seemed like a waste of effort to me, but if incinerating the corpses of our erstwhile assailants made him happy, then good luck to him. For my part, I ducked the scrap of parchment inside my shirt for safekeeping, trying to ignore the close contact and the way it made my skin crawl. It certainly looked cheerful enough when Jurgen lit the corpses as the flames took hold, flickering gently against the deep purple of the star flecked sky, and and I amused myself for a while, trying to pick out which of the pinpoints of light above us were orbiting starships, until the wind shifted abruptly, and the stench of burning meat combined with a deepening chill to dive me back inside the pod. There, of course, it was almost impossible to see, since the lighting system was dead, as everything else required to function. But once again, the well-stocked survival kit came to our aid, and I puzzled at the crude map we'd recovered by the light of a hand illuminator balanced by one of the bunks. It was too candid to sleep on, of course, but I was exhausted enough to feel perfectly comfortable on a nest of rolled-up sleeping bags, stuffed into the angle of the bulkhead and floor, and drifted off to sleep as soon as I killed the light. Jurgen, to my unspoken relief, had elected to take a bedroll outside, where he could make the most of the freezing temperature, and his ever-present odor intensified as always by the daytime heat, and mercifully followed. Like most Valhallans, Jurgen had a passing familiarity with Orcish script. He had been good enough to familiarize me with the basics, or at least their Gothic equivalents. So after a while, I was able to work out some of their meaning. If I'm reading this right, I said cautiously, while enjoying a leisurely breakfast of reconstituted soylents, verdants on the hull the next morning. They were camped out on the oasis back there. I gestured in the direction of the long scar left by the pod as it bounced and slithered to a halt the previous day. Jurgen nodded, leaning to look more closely at the map I held, and leaving me no doubt to that rising sun as it did its usual job of bringing out the best of his distinctive bouquet. That is the symbol for a camp, he agreed, and it looks more or less in the right place. The map had nothing so sophisticated as a scale of distances, but the sigil he pointed out was more or less in the center of it, and after a bit of thought, we'd been able to match a peculiar wavy line along one edge to a stretch of coastline on the eastern continent. I shrugged. We descended on the site with the impact of a couple of kilotons of Felicine, so there was no point in going to see if any of the other greenskins had survived. More to the point, there wouldn't be much left back there which would help to sustain Jurgen and myself. Well, we know where they came from, I said. I pointed to a spot a short distance from the flattened oasis. And we're about here. There was only one brutish rune further along in that direction, and I tapped it with my fingertip. So they must have been heading for this place, whatever that splooge means. Looks like the symbol for fighting, Jurgen volunteered. Or lots of enemies, he shrugged too, and replenished my mug of recap from the pot, hissing quietly on the portable stove we'd scavenged from the survival kit before I'd awoken. I took the drink gratefully. I'd have preferred a pot of Tana, to be honest, but the rations aboard the pod had not been packed with the Valhallans in mind, and that peculiar little luxury would have to wait until we'd rejoined our regiment, assuming they'd managed to survive the attack on our starship unscathed, of course. Then that's where we'll head for, I said decisively. If you read much of these scribblings, my apparent willingness to go charging off in the direction of what seemed like a battle zone may strike you as a little uncharacteristic, to say the least, but to my mind, Anywhere the orcs felt was full of enemies sounded like the right place to be. With any luck, we'd be able to find and make contact with our own forces. And at the very least, we had to find some PDF trolls to hide behind while we made our way back to the regiment. From which musings you might fairly deduce that I was still blissfully ignorant of just how bad a situation we were actually in. That'll be a fair trek, Jurgen pointed out. We'll need to get as much of this stuff stored in the backpacks as we can. I nodded. Especially the water, I said. Under these conditions, we'd need as much of it as we could. I hadn't exactly the time to admire the scenery on our way down, but I'd seen enough to realize that pockets of civilization were few and far between. It was likely to be more than a few weeks before we got anywhere, even if we were lucky. The irony was that the survival pod contained enough to sustain the pair of us for months if necessary. But remaining here would simply mean we'd starve to death later rather than sooner. Better to set out while we were still strong enough to make the arduous journey. Besides, the fact that we'd undoubtedly annihilated the orc camp when we crashed on it was no guarantee that we'd be spared any more of the unwanted visitors. If another patrol had set out ahead of the one that attacked us, they could easily stumble across the abandoned vehicles of their compatriots on the way back and come to investigate. Jurgen, I'm an idiot, I told him. My aide looked at me quizzically, his mouth hanging open, just enough to give a rather good look at his half-chewed breakfast. We might not have to abandon supplies after all. Do you think you could drive one of the buggy things? So I suppose the brief dramatis personae here. Caiaphas Cain. Caiaphas Cain is a commissar, and he gets to be a hero. And I suppose me reading his lines, it vicariously almost makes me feel like a hero. And the thing about him is he's a hero in a place and a time where no one's allowed to be a hero. You can be a martyr. You can get yourself killed. That'll get you nice and rich and famous. But unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of time to spend it when you're dead. So yeah, I like Cain, but I also like his bodyguard Jurgen. Jurgen and Cain are from two very different worlds. Cain is from a hive world. He lived in a big city that was stacked on top of a bigger city that was stacked on, well, you could guess it. It goes on and on and on. Jurgen lived in an ice planet. And so seeing their two worlds collide over and over again is kind of fun. It's kind of fun. This book is pretty good. And I really hate to taint the well, but all it makes me want to do is read Caves of Ice. It's the same book, except they're just like in Caves of Ice, but what's in the Caves of Ice with them is pretty cool. You'll never be able to buy that book again, though. It got retconned. It got unalived. The things that happened in those caves weren't allowed to happen. It's denied even by the book publishing company, the Black Library. They won't print it anymore because they don't follow that narrative. But I remember every time they change the story. And I can tell you this, almost every time they change the story, they make it worse. Almost every time. Apparently, there's like a Necron that can time travel, and that makes me really upset. But it also makes me realize that he's the reason the Necrons changed. He gave them the salvation they needed. Instead of just being mindless, well, they had a choice. They could either be slaves or enslave. And so he switched it. So I guess in a way, the great, the great net balance of freedom remained even. But he was willing to commit, in this narrative I'm constructing, the very same sin that he accuses oppressors of. But this is all fan fiction. A little cautious experimentation was enough to prove that he could, with almost as much ease as he handled the salamander I had habitually requisitioned. The orc vehicles were undeniably crude, but that meant their controls were correspondingly simple, and my aide was able to work them out without too much difficulty. In truth, there was little more to them than a throttle, a steering column, and a brake. Shortly after we began our examination, Jurgen had managed to fire up the engine, and having spent a few moments getting the feel of the sturdy little vehicle, he opened the throttle and disappeared over the rim of the nearest dune in a flurry of sand and profanity. I was able to follow his progress by the sound of the engine, and after a few moments he reappeared. A broad grin across his face, and slewed to a halt next to me, raising a miniature sandstorm. "It'll do," he conceded, which is about as close as he was likely to come to expressing enthusiasm for anything orcish, and I nodded. Everything else we'd have to face, whatever else we'd have to face, we wouldn't have to walk to wherever we were going after all. I gestured to the other two vehicles. "We better get the fuel cans from those," I said, beginning to unstrap the nearest. "Emperor alone knows where we might find some more out here." Jurgen nodded. "Best to be on the safe side," he conceded. There was nothing else worth taking on either of them, so once the canisters were safely stowed, I swung myself aboard and directed Jurgen to take me back to the life pod. "One more thing," I said, as he jerked us into motion again. I swung the heavy bolter, which I had been clinging to for support. For a moment, I find myself wondering if it would still function, its spirit having been corrupted by its enforced servitude in the hands of our enemies. But it had apparently remained loyal to the Emperor and opened up as readily as if it had been mounted on the chimera from which it had evidently been ripped. The hail of shells tore the orc bike things to shreds, which was hardly surprising at this range, cooking off the ammunition and their own weapons and igniting the fuel still in their tanks with almost a satisfying roar. "We don't want the greenskins getting these back now, do we?" "No, sir, we really don't," my aide agreed, and opened the throttle fully. Our trip back to the pod was mercifully short, but unpleasant nevertheless. The greenskin who'd built the ramshackle vehicle we rode in had neither heard of the concept of suspension or considered it something for sissies. By the time we reached our destination, I was beginning to have severe doubts about the wisdom of this course of action, but we didn't really have much of a choice. Attempting to walk out of the desert would take us far longer, if we even made it out at all, and however uncomfortable the buggy might have been, It was at least well adapted to the terrain I'd expected us to be bogged down in. Our next job was to load up as much of the supplies aboard as we reasonably could. Food and water were our first priority, of course, and after that, bedding and ancillary equipment. Most of this I left to Jurgen, his expertise in this area being considerably greater than mine, and went to check out the contents of the arms locker. Apart from the las guns he'd already used on the orcs, and which had remained slung across his shoulders since then, there were 11 other standard issue assault weapons, along with 5 boxes of power cells for them. Reluctant to leave anything behind which an enemy might find useful, I added them to the stack of equipment to take with us. A fortuitous decision, which, although it seemed like a waste of our limited space at the time, was to turn out to be more than vindicated. I had hoped that the supplement to them was something with a heavier caliber, but the pod's designers had obviously decided that if you needed support weapons, you'd either be able to find them for yourself or you were done for anyways, and devoted the limited storage space aboard to survival gear and comestibles. The last thing I found was a drawer full of comm beads, no doubt intended to let the survivors of a crash landing explore their surroundings without losing touch with one another. I seized them gratefully, slipping one into my ear and running rapidly through the frequencies. My commissarial codes were enough to give me full access to any Imperial transmissions in the vicinity. But to my complete lack of surprise, all I could find anywhere was static. Nevertheless, the familiar feel of the thing in my ear was obscurely comforting, and I picked one up for Jurgen too, along with a number of spares. We weren't all that likely to run into a tech priest out here, and the last thing I wanted to was to lose touch at a critical moment. By the time we'd finished loading the buggy, leaving barely enough room for the pair of us to squeeze aboard, the morning was well advanced, and I decided to have one more meal before we set off. Despite our best efforts, there was still a considerable quantity of food left aboard the pod, or a fair amount of the basic ration bars at least, and it seemed a shame to waste any more of them than was strictly necessary. Despite their usual, probably fortunate lack of any identifiable flavor, we ate a couple apiece and tucked a few more away in our pockets, just to be on the safe side. Well then, I said at last, tearing myself away from our refuge with a searing amount of reluctance, I suppose we ought to be going. I scrambled aboard the buggy, wedging myself as comfortably as I could between the heavy bolter and some crates of survival equipment, and waited for Jurgen as he fired up the engine, which belched a plume of foul-smelling exhaust into the clear desert air. Time we saw what's out there. Had I known, of course, I'd probably have dug the deepest hole I could find in the sand and pulled it in on top of me. But I still thought we were close enough to our own lines to find refuge with little difficulty. So I braced myself as Jurgen kicked our ramshackle vehicle into gear, and with a roar and a bounce, which seemed to loosen the filings in my teeth, we rattled off to meet our destiny. So at 100 pages in, the book begins. 100 pages of exposition out of 400, but I skip some chapters because it's not clearly necessary. It kind of bogs down the pace for reading it aloud, but it might be a fun little bonus, one day if you ever wanted to read it yourself. Death or Glory. It will improve your vocabulary, or it'll just make you lose faith in it altogether. The second happened to me. I thought I had a very clear command of the English language, but just in that chapter, there was one word I don't think I've ever seen that before. I've read this book, years ago. I don't even remember that word. I cannot say that reading is particularly fun, but I will say that rereading is very fun. It's almost like the first time you're not really sure what to expect, but the second time around, you find yourself looking in deeper, darker corners and picking things up. That is why I absolutely recommend having a tiny little library. Tiny little library. It certainly looks aesthetic when they all kind of match. But beware, you can trick yourself into only reading those kinds of books that match the books that you've read before. And that is a trick that I've fallen to. And I might not ever recover from it. However, it's not such a bad thing. The rest of the day passed without incident, despite my natural apprehension at the prospect of attracting attention from any enemies in the immediate vicinity. My fears in this regard were far from unfounded, as my unseen lurkers would have had more than adequate warning of our approach. The roar of our engine echoed from the dunes surrounding us, loudly enough to blot out almost any other sound from my ringing ears, and I blessed the foresight which impelled me to pass off one of the combies of the Jurgen before we set off. Without them, conversation would have been impossible. Not that it was exactly easy even then. We progressed in a series of spine jarring jolts, each one which drove the breath from my lungs, so that whatever remarks we did manage to exchange were generally interrupted by statico hesitations, every other word. After a while, I discovered that the discomfort was marginally less if I stood at the bolter, or to be more accurate, clung onto the thing for dear life, letting my knees flex with the bouncing of our sturdy little vehicle. And that is what allowed me a better view of our surroundings. Using an amplivisor would have been impossible under the circumstances, so I had to make do with what I could see with my own aided eyes. And I have to admit, this wasn't a lot. I guess that's the big takeaway, that Sandy, or maybe I'll just call him Mr. Mitchell. I guess that's the big takeaway for him is he really puts himself in these situations. I feel like he did this. He got on the back of a vehicle with bad suspension and tried to figure out how to make it less bad without actually changing the vehicle. And now he's talking about how hard it is to even see around. And I mean, that kind of just plays into like, yeah, when these vehicles start shooting, they're very inaccurate. It's kind of what he's alluding to. Is it's not a stable firing platform. It's an engine with a gun on the top, and it's not, the gun doesn't even face forward. The gun's on a pintle mount. So you're or orcish engineering works because they believe in it. But if there's no orc there to believe in it, does it still work? This wasn't to say that the landscape was unvaryingly monotonous. However, occasional outcrops of reddish brown rocks broke through the sand, like reefs in an ocean of dust, and thin patches of desiccated scrub clung grimly to whatever crevices they could find. Lichens, too, speckled their surfaces and an astonishing profusion of colors, although perhaps the eye simply picked them out more easily because of the contrast they made with their surroundings. Of animal life, I saw no obvious sign, although I have no doubt that there was something there. If there's one thing I've learned in my travels across the galaxy, it's that life is incredibly tenacious, and it will manage to find a way of getting by even the most amicable of environments. At length, with the shadows beginning to stretch across the sky, I decided to call it a halt. Jurgen complied with alacrity, which was hardly surprising given that he'd been wrestling those cumbersome controls for most of the afternoon and coasted us to a halt at the lee of one of the outcrops of rock. I jumped down gratefully, almost stumbling as the sand gave way beneath my boots, and I tried to stretch some feeling back into my cramped and knotted limbs. How far do you think we've come? I asked, reaching for the nearest bundle of survival rations and heaving it into the ground beside me. Jurgen shrugged. Oh, about 82 kilom, he said, beginning to set up the stove. I raised an eyebrow, surprised. That far? I asked, trying not to sound skeptical. Jurgen nodded, taking the rhetorical question as literally as he tended to take anything else. They spelt skeptical wrong. They spelt it with a C instead of a K. So is that on the author or is that on the editor? It's on both of them. That's pretty fast given the conditions and the way the buggy's loaded down. Oh. Okay, you know what? Once again, I've said this once and I'll say it again. Pacing is my hardest. It's the most difficult thing for me is finding a good pace. And this is with many things. I really think that it's better to have a good pace and be bad at something than vice versa, I think. Because when you have pace, you have self-control. And it's not just self-control, but it's the most important self-control because you know when to apply yourself. You know, it's so easy to burn out quick, and I've seen many burnouts, and it's also so easy to never really live your life and just be a walking body for 8 decades. But you know, between that, there's probably some nice fine, area between there. It's hard to slow down for me sometimes, so I just stop. But then I have to tell myself that doesn't mean that I just catch up afterwards. And you've also got to want to do something, okay? Like making these little videos, it's something that I don't always feel like doing. And so it's not, my pacing certainly, if I had a more regular pace, I think it would pay off because people want something more regular. But I just do it when I feel like it because I feel like otherwise you're forcing it. And if you're forcing it and it's not fun, it like I and that's the thing, right? It's not really that bad when people sell out. I don't care when people sell out. That's kind of the dream, right? Is selling out. That's making it is selling out. It's getting to a point where you're so valuable that they'll pay you to stop doing that thing that you did, or just to do it in a different way or something, right? But the reason it's bad when people sell out, and I hope to goodness gracious this never happens to me, is they just lose that truth, that wonderful sound, that vision that they had and wanted to give the world. That stops becoming the prime driving force, and instead it's just money. It's just money. Money, 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 money. And don't get me wrong, it's like super fun to spend money, but earning money and spending money are like two different things. So if you think that you're going to be like somehow conditioning yourself to like make more money, I don't know. It just doesn't work like that, okay? At the point where it's just to make more money and do money and money, then it's not fun. I don't know why you do it. I don't know why anyone would do that. That sounds like hell. What ends up happening, right? It's not like, okay, you get this piece of paper, or you know somebody, and you get there, and well, okay, you're making all this money, and now you're stuck because are you seriously going to downgrade now that you're making that, right? You have a lifestyle and you're locked in. You're not going to give up that lifestyle, right? And so that, I mean, that's the risk of being wealthy, is being stuck wealthy. And maybe this is all just a cope, but I mean, I don't know. If they're working for themselves and they're having fun, then by all means, that's great. But if they're just some accountant somewhere, I mean, man, I mean, to me, that would be hell. Like that, when I die, they're gonna make me an accountant in hell. They're gonna make me in charge of the head count of all the sinners coming through. I'm gonna add myself to the list, and then I'm gonna have to watch them all come through. And every time I fuck up the paperwork, they're gonna come tell me, and that's gonna be the worst part. Because I'm gonna be like, "Fuck! I didn't think I'd fuck off again," and that's gonna be my hell. Because I'm sure that's basically what everyone does, except instead of counting sinners, they make sinners, or they make centers for sinners, right? Like it's all the same shit. It's all just fucking. It's all just sin. That's all the money is, and it's fun to sin. I love sinning. But when you give yourself up to that like prospect of it, I mean, it's just like, I don't know. Could all be cope though. Could all be cope. Who knows? At length, with the shadows beginning to stretch and the sky becoming tinged with purple, I decided to call a halt. Jurgen complied with alacrity, which was hardly surprising, given that he'd been wrestling with the cumbersome controls for most of the afternoon. How far do you think we've come? I asked. Jurgen shrugged. About 80 km, he said. I raised an eyebrow. That far? That is pretty fast given the conditions. And the way the buggy's loaded down, he said. I couldn't argue with that, so I left him to set up camp and wandered up the side of the outcrop, searching for some firmer footing where I could try and work out some flexibility back into my limbs with a little chainsword practice, now that the air was cool enough to make physical exercise feasible again. Fortunately, I found it, and by the time I'd furnished, running through the familiar routines of attack and defense, I was beginning to feel a great deal calmer and more comfortable. I returned to the campsite in a mood I can only describe as mellow, to find that Jurgen had been busy in my absence. Darkness was falling in earnest, bringing with it the nighttime chill, and I retrieved my greatcoat from the buggy. After a hot meal and a mug of recaf, I retreated to the survival bubble he'd erected, rolling myself in the sleeping bag I found there, and drifted off into the last night of untroubled slumber I was to enjoy for some weeks to come. Not that the following morning gave us any present. Not that the following morning gave us any presentiment of what was in store. I woke to find Jurgen already abroad, stirring something gray and lumpy in a pan on the portable stove, which, despite its appearance, smelled surprisingly appetizing. He glanced up as I stepped carefully over his bedroll, which he'd laid out just outside the bubble, and handed me a mug of recaf. Almost ready, sir, he assured me, and went back to tending the porridge. Emperor alone knows what was in it. but it was packed with enough nutrients to leave me feeling ready for anything. I began whistling cheerfully as I started the job of breaking camp. As I'd stowed some of the equipment and carried a couple of bundles back to the buggy, my aide's silently reproachful look finally succeeded in reminding me that this was supposed to be his department, and I decided I'd better let him get on with it without any further interference. Jurgen was, if nothing else, a stickler for protocol, which normally made my life considerably easier, since it was otherwise than it otherwise might have been. In the years to come, even generals were to find themselves politely but firmly fobbed off when I couldn't be bothered to deal with them. Knowing that to persist in what he undoubtedly regarded as a menial task, far beneath my dignity as a commissar, would leave him disgruntled for the rest of the day, I returned to the outcrop I'd climbed the evening before with an amplivisor and scanned the horizon, hoping to gather some clue as to what our whereabouts might be. From my elevated position, I'd found I could see a great deal further than I'd expected in the clear desert air, and my attention was drawn to a faint smudge on the horizon, roughly in our direction of travel. My curiosity piqued, magnifying the image as much as I could, and I tried to make out a few more details. "I think we're approaching a town," I told Jurgen, the faint rattles and bangs being picked off by his combi telling me he was stowing our equipment in the buggy with his usual efficiency. I tried to bring the image into clear focus, but the heat haze was already beginning to shimmer over the sands, and it was hard to make out anything other than the vague outline of walls and buildings. Try as I might, I was unable to resolve any details of the inhabitants, if indeed there were any. It could be the splotch on the map we were headed for. "That sounds likely," my aide agreed. "Orcs mark one of their towns down as lots of enemies, all right." He hesitated, and then went on, a note of caution in his voice. "Mind you, sir, they think that even if only there are civilians there." I see. I lowered the vision enhancers thoughtfully. That hadn't occurred to me before, and the idea of trotting blithely into an orc-infested killing ground, which is what any urban area is to an infantry soldier. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Nevertheless, I couldn't see any other alternative. We mainly couldn't continue to drive aimlessly around the desert until our supplies ran out. "We'd best proceed with caution, then." "Very good, sir," my aide agreed, barely able to keep a note of relief from his voice. A moment later, the roar of our badly tuned engine shattered the stillness of the desert. Don't want to attract too much attention now, do we?